This is the World Organic News for the week ending 17th of July 2017. Jon Moore reporting. This week, a fuel cell solar and wind-powered boat, ancient wheat genes, seaweed for ruminants, and do less to protect more. Let's get into it. From the blog News comes the post, self-fueling boat starts 6-year round world trip using green energy fuel cells. This vessel is covered topsides with solar panels and has a couple of vertical axis wind turbines. From the post. Quote, Energy Observer will use its solar panels, wind turbines and a hydrogen fuel cell system to power its trip. €5 million boat heads off from Paris towards the Atlantic today. July 16, 2017. The futuristic-looking 100-foot boat will rely on sun or wind during the day and tap into its hydrogen reservoirs at night. It produces its own hydrogen through electrolysis of seawater. Originally designed in 1983, the boat enjoyed a successful career in open sea sailing races before skippers Frédéric Dahiel and Victorien Urassad and a French research institute converted it into the Energy Observer project. End quote. This vessel should not really be necessary. Set up as a demonstration to show the practicalities of mixed-source renewable power, it has some value. But surely we are now at a point where we no longer need to prove the viability of these technologies. Indeed, the idea of solar and wind combinations was bigger back in the 80s and 90s. My uncle has an off-grid place where he has both wind and solar, and has had for 20 plus years. As he says, usually when it's cloudy there will be some wind, and when it's not cloudy, the sun's shining. So I applaud the Energy Observer project, but let's get this sorted, people. The technologies are extant, the price is dropping, and the need is urgent. Our next post is entitled, Researchers Put Some of the Wild Back into Domesticated Wheat. From the blog Scientific Inquirer. As climate changes, the industrialised narrow gene pool in domestic cereals has come under some pressure already. Whilst they are good for producing large quantities of food in relatively consistent conditions, they don't handle change well. Back in episode 65 on the 22nd of May 2017, I discussed the flooding of the Svalbard seed bank in Norway. Link in the show notes. These seed banks hold ancient forms of the modern cereals, amongst other things. Researchers at the University of Kansas studied the genome of an ancient variety of wheat and compared it with modern cultivars. Quote, The relative of wheat is called wild emmer, which is one of the founding crops of human society, said Edvard Achnerhav, Professor of Plant Pathology and Wheat Genomics at Kansas State University. Wild emmer was one of the first crops that was domesticated 10,000 years ago, which was a critical step in moving from hunter-gathering to an agricultural society. End quote. By having this ancient genome and comparing it with modern varieties, traits such as drought and heat tolerance can be spotted. With this knowledge, better breeding programs can adjust modern varieties by backcrossing and so on. Another quote. The small segments of the wild emmer chromosomes are being transferred to bred wheat, and these segments can carry some useful genes in there, and they can be used in crossbreeding programs. It is a valuable source for improving end-use quality of wheat, especially grain composition, mineral content and protein content. There are a number of genes that are known to improve this trait, and they are coming from wild emmer. End quote. This post reinforces the importance of seed banks around the world. I have some seed from an older variety of wheat from Egypt, which I used in bread making. The differences are apparent. Greater depth of flavour, a bit more water was needed in the dough making process, and a slightly nutty taste. Not dissimilar to spelt in that respect, but much better rising ability whilst proving. So I'm an advocate for this sort of research, and that's why I encourage you all to find your local seed banks and seed swapping groups to maintain as much variety in your local food crops as possible. Now onto a piece from the Irish Times entitled Seaweed Shown to Reduce 99% Methane from Cattle. This is brilliant. I've always included seaweed meal in my feed for stock for the mineral content and the iodine deficiencies here in Australia. To find this article is wonderful, especially as it draws upon work done here in Australia and in Canada. Let's get to the crux of the matter. Quote, Researchers at James Cook University in Queensland, Australia, found the addition of less than 2% dried seaweed to a cow's diet could reduce their methane emissions by as much as 99%. End quote. So what's the big deal about methane? Any number of vegan sites will point you to the vast amounts of methane belched by cattle and other ruminants around the world. Methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, but it also dissipates from the atmosphere in a matter of years, not centuries. So removing methane from the meat supply chain will have a significant effect on the atmosphere. If we add to this the removal of stock from confined animal feeding operations, feedlots in other words, they will no longer be standing in their own faeces, but will be returning those faeces to the paddocks where the earthworms and dung beetles can incorporate the manures into the soil. This will raise soil carbon content by pulling it out of the atmosphere and into the soil where it belongs. So with the addition of a small amount of seaweed to the diets of ruminants around the world, and their return to rotational grazing, we can pretty much positively affect greenhouse gas concentrations and feed people at the same time. Amazing. And finally for this week comes the post, Less Mowing, More Pollinators, from Bee Farm Ranch. Not everyone is aware that allowing grassed areas to run to seed is actually pretty good for the grassed areas. It is also wonderful for pollinators. Given the obsession with bowling green lawns in the developed world, it is not surprising this source of food for bees, butterflies and other pollinators has been declining. Here is something we can do to help these useful creatures by doing less ourselves. In my mind, grassland never looks healthy unless it has a decent sward and blend of species. So I've never been a fan of manicured lawns sprayed relentlessly to kill off anything that might outcompete the grasses. By returning to more meadow-like lawns and allowing them to flower, we'll be saving ourselves time behind a mower and providing food for pollinators. Win-win. And on that happy note, we will end this week's episode. If you've liked what you've heard, please tell everyone you know any way you can. I'd also really appreciate a review on iTunes or the podcatcher of your choice. This may or may not help others to find us, but it gives this podcaster an enormous thrill. Thanks in advance. Any questions, feedback or criticism of the podcast or blog are most welcome. Email me at podcast@worldorganicnews.com. Thanks for listening. I'll be back in a week.